Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I think Will's over there in that corner. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Maury Richards. He's the former police chief of Martinsburg, West Virginia, among other things. Maury, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. Policing is always a hot topic, and it's good to get insights from people inside. You don't often get to talk to people who have actually done the job, right? Who can say that these things, common sense would tell you that they are, but to actually say these things are more complex than they seem, right? But so we're going to cover a lot of stuff, obviously, but I guess it's important to start with what you would say police see and how they react to and what they are saying and thinking about the way they're perceived in America right now.
Well, we're at a tremendous point of crisis here. I'd say policing in America is very close to being broken, and it's not by accident. If you look at starting with Black Lives Matter, with this whole systemic, police are systemic racist, that type of hoax, which is also perpetuated by the Democratic Party, ruling class media. It's become the dominant narrative. And, that has resulted in a number of really bad things, starting with, the 2020 riots, which is the real insurrection in this country, in my opinion. Which is not being investigated tonight. So you've got that. And then a lot of other things came together as well. The whole George Soros funded, district attorney and prosecutors. They've taken over maybe 24 major jurisdictions. And, these people are, hardcore radicals, no interest in putting criminals in jail, but really want to dismantle the system. So now you've got that going on, which is, resulted in, skyrocketing crime. And then you've got the hate campaign on the police, which in turn, leads to, more assaults. Last year, there were about 78 policemen, murdered in America, 346 shot. So there really is a war on cops. So you put all this together and you have a very demoralized police force, across this country. And, the tragedy of this whole thing is, and it really shows the incredible, phoniness of, the Democrats and Black Lives Matter, is that the real victims are the Black community. Last year, about 10,000 Black homicide victims. And, that's half of all homicide victims in the country, almost all in, major urban areas, run by Democrats, a lot with these radical prosecutors. So, the real, victims are the community and the people that they claim to care about.
Wow. But so why, obviously you believe that what there's a direct link to BLM and this negativity, obviously actual physical attacks on police, but a little more about the police themselves and what they say. Are they, people talk about the Ferguson and now the George Floyd effect. Are they, taking a step back? And if so, why? Are they just, being less proactive? Is that because of directives that they get, or is that just like they don't want to be, on the next video? Or how are they? We hear about the numbers of them retiring in record numbers in certain cities. I know Chicago has a really big problem with even having a number of police they need to police the city. So on one hand, people are saying we want to defund the police. They're going to get de facto defunding when everybody retires and then new people don't want to be cops. So talk about, a little bit more of that, how they see it from that standpoint and what their direct actions are in reaction to what has happened.
Yeah, well, in almost all major cities, the police have definitely pulled back, and that's for a number of reasons. Part of it is just this demoralization, afraid to take proactive measures because, one misstep or an honest mistake, you're going to be on, YouTube, you're going to be indicted, you're going to end up in prison, even if you're trying to do your job. And, don't get me wrong, Charles. I mean, there are a few bad cops out there. And, as a chief and as a supervisor, I've got no sympathy for these people. If you're bad, you don't need to be on the job. If you commit a crime, you should go to jail. But that is such a minority of officers. It's hard to believe. So there is that pullback. People are afraid they're not getting backed up. But then you have another pullback that's going on. And this gets back to these radical prosecutors, which in a number of cities, they've totally refused to prosecute many what I call, quality of life crimes. Drug possession, drug dealing on the street prostitution, trespass, public drinking, urination, theft. These things aren't even being prosecuted. So consequently, those officers aren't even making those arrests. So there's a tremendous amount of depolicing going on across the country in every major city.
Shamika, what do you think about this from the reaction to the BLM and the animus toward police?
I definitely think that's a reason for it. I know here, and of course, this isn't a big city. I know that there's like 100 openings for police officers. I've been to other cities and seen them advertise for, they're looking for police here. And I talked to someone who left the police office left the police department to go to the sheriff's office. And he was just saying, it's awful. Like, you really can't do your job. And I didn't think some of those smash and grabs were happening in this area. I thought that was happening like in California and other states with, really large Democrat-run cities that you just hear about crime all the time. I just saw today where there's a place in Cary, which is just a town over, which is a nice middle class area. There's this place that's been hit twice, a boutique, very organized, smash and grab, it seems. They come in and they've taken, she said that she's probably lost about $40,000 worth of merchandise. And so I'm looking, and it's just getting worse all over the country. I really didn't think it was happening here. And I was very surprised that, yes, and in Cary, which is supposed to be a really nice place.
Will, you can obviously address whatever you would like from Maury, but I do want you to also add your piece, because you write about this a lot. You wrote a book about the hoax, obviously, but just the fact that the narrative that made everybody upset to start burning things down wasn't even statistically true, right? So we have all this anger because police are indiscriminately shooting people, because the people on certain news channels are telling us this, and the celebrities that we endear are telling us this. So it must be true, even if we don't see it in our own circle. It must be true, because why else would Julianne Moore or LeBron say this stuff? So it must be true. So talk about what you think that contributed to this problem.
Well, I mean, I think LeBron says a lot of dumb stuff because he's a jackass who's never going to beat Jordan. I mean, he's gotten a whole bunch of these high profile stories. I mean, if you'll recall, claiming that someone spray painted the word nigger on the front of his mansion. He brought in the police, wasted the day for a whole team of officers. Where was it? Well, it must have been painted over already. I mean, LeBron James, there's actually an incident just now. There's a, and I don't want to, this is nothing to gloat over or anything like this, but there was an incident where there was a interracial brawl in front of LeBron James's school and a kid got killed. Happened to be a white kid, which is why we haven't heard too much about it. But I mean, LeBron is not really taking that podium and getting too active when it comes to actual policing and actual race violence and gang issues literally in his backyard. So I'm not a huge fan of the guy. I tend to share Clay Travis's opinion. But anywho, this was one of the things that I think was really, we all said it honestly. I think all four of us up here from that, position of moderate, like local news fame. But it was very risky for a while to say that the Black Lives Matter narrative was often just BS. And I mean, there were these very, very public claims that were made. I mean, the one that comes to my mind is Sharon Obiko on primetime Fox, except for maybe CNN or ABC, that's the national news, saying that pretty much every day an unarmed Black man is murdered, quote, by the police. This was constant. It turns out, and all of you have read my book, we've all read one another's books, but I mean, this is completely false. The total number of unarmed Black men killed in a typical year by the police is like 12. Last year was 18. Even if you add in that 75% Caucasian Hispanic majority, who no one cares about, by the way, it's under 100 guys. Right. And unarmed doesn't mean what you think it does. I mean, across like the Blacks, the Southern whites, Mexicans, I mean, you have people doing things like driving trucks toward the cops when these shootings happen. So yeah, the narrative itself was false. And I think that the right has had the courage to say that for like a year and a half. What's striking though is the consequences that we've seen. And a lot of these things that online are often used by whites on the right, frankly, to almost make Black people look bad, aren't constants. They're things that come out of idiotic urban policies like this. So in the past couple of years, we've seen the number of homicides creep back up over 20,000. That's what it used to be in 1994 during the crack era. When I had my unfashionable white tee with like the Looney Tunes on it, my skateboard and so on. I was going to school in the hood, actually. I mean, it's that level of crime. You're again getting the same stuff, like people peeing inside trains. Like that disrespect for the law is what happens when you don't let the cops do their job. Or the citizens do a worse version of the police's job, by the way. I mean, another part of this is disarming ordinary people. Anyway, murders are up over 20,000. Black people have always had a somewhat elevated homicide rate. I mean, we tend to be a younger community. There's a history of racism. But since like the 1960s, we've seen the Black percentage of murder victims, this is crazy, go from about 25% to last year, 57%. So most people that get killed in the USA are Black. This is crazy. This isn't like Black guy and white guy sparring, oh, your rate's twice what it should be. This is most murder victims are Black. And you could argue that's a direct result of Black Lives Matter because poor white communities have a high crime rate, but they're still enforcing the law. There aren't people going out and marching when a criminal there gets shot. So, I mean, in Black communities right now, and this is definitely Gascon is implicated in this and many of these other prosecutors, but you're very often seeing a return to 1990s level of crime directly following police pullback. I guess that's what I'm saying. So yeah, that's the statistical reality on the ground. And a lot of the lives that are being lost are Black lives. Although last sentence, I will say that white or Hispanic or whatever lives don't matter any less. If the guy that gets shot who's out there in the street scene is Armenian, I mean, we can't deflect from that and say Black lives matter. Everyone who's living in these cities is at elevated risk because of this. But of those 20,000 homicides, 10,000 or more are Black people. So that is more my concern as a Black man, obviously.
Right. You sure it isn't a result of slavery? Because that's what we're told.
That's a great bounce pass right there. One of the things, there are things in the Black community like less generational wealth that are due to past racism. I want to say that although this panel leans right, none of us, including Maury, is a bigot. I mean, so yes, of course, when you ask why do older Black men not have money? Well, because there are like 3 jobs available to them. Most of them settled on farming as far away as possible for the white man or whatever. But when you look, and that's not the reason why younger Black people don't have that much wealth, by the way. That's a complex question. But anyway, getting to the point, most of these things, when you look at something like rates of crime or fatherlessness, no, those have not been constant since slavery. And I think this is one of the big contributions of the Black right to this discussion. I mean, if you read someone like Walter Williams or the OG, the immortal Tom Sowell, I mean, you'll see that in 1938, 1945, the Black fatherlessness rate was like 10%. Whites are doing a bit better. You're talking about 4 to 6%, but a very small, very comparable difference. All of this began really in the 1960s with welfare policy, the bipartisan outsourcing of good jobs, so on down the line, a couple other things. I mean, you could argue feminism to some extent, no fault divorce and the like played a role here. I think Shamika might say that. But no, the kids not having dads in Black, or for that matter, in working class white communities, Hispanic communities, I mean, many of the individuals in those communities wouldn't have been here. No, that doesn't trace back to slavery. And for that matter, it's not just a Black issue.
Well, obviously, you said a lot of important things there, but and I'm going to go to Maury in a minute. But I do want to say one of the things that you said was about the percentage that are Black, and I'll never forget. I mean, this can't be the only time it's happened, but the only time I heard it, and it was just on the regular evening news. And you look around, it's like, does everybody hear what they said? I was in New York at the time. It was the Summer of Love. And there was a lot of shootings in New York that weekend. I don't know, like 60 or something. And just matter of factly, the anchor says, you know, there's been a lot of shootings this weekend, blah, blah, blah. And before I go, goes back to the person in the studio saying, one thing of note, every single victim who was shot this weekend was Black or Hispanic. 100% of the victims were minorities. Right. Mm-hmm. So while this rhetoric can go around about who's the fault, is it slavery? What do the white people do? They don't really care about us. Maybe they don't care. You know, let's give them their argument. Maybe they don't care. But shouldn't we care enough that we're marching about the one guy? And we had a weekend in the biggest city in the country where every person shot, which is far too many that weekend, but every person shot was a minority, and just part of the news and no one knows about it. That's crazy. And that's important to note, because like Maury said, the vast majority of the people harmed by these things are going to be Black and other minorities. But to you, Maury, this is what I want to say. Will also said that there is that a lot of, and you mentioned it too a bit about, you know, he said the difference between, say, this crime in Appalachia. But the difference is you all are still trying to enforce the law, where these DAs in these big cities are just throwing their hands up and just let them all out. But there is a contingent who believes, you know, and this isn't just the hard left. The hard left is like, you know, abolish police. But a lot of people left and some center right, this big talk now when they talk about criminal justice reform, which I'll get my opinion. My opinion is not popular even on the right. But it's just, you know, we do need reforms. We don't need to lock up non-violent offenses. But I'm like, so what do you do? Like you even mentioned, you know, and Will mentioned someone who's, you know, urinating in the street, you know, open air drug markets and all this thing. So we decide as a society, these people don't go to jail. Is it nothing? What can you do then? If you do nothing, you get more of it. And then that person who's now high and drunk moves on to other things, right? So I hate to sound like Rudy Giuliani and the broken windows thing, but I mean, it's not a Rudy thing. It's a common sense thing. You know, if you allow people to do these things, they do more. So one, what do you think about this? Obviously, I think I know what you think, but the problem of this constant push to non-violent equals non-jail, let's just focus on the violent offenders, which is a problem because they change the definition of what's violent. And then what do you do with people if you don't lock them up?
Right. No, I mean, those are great questions. You know, talking about broken windows, which for the audience is, you know, enforcing, you know, low level crimes. I mean, things you talk about, drug possession, you know, trespass, public urination, just general disorder. Because it's not just a theory; it's been proven that if you allow these lower level crimes to continue without any kind of consequences, a couple things are going to happen. One, those offenders become more emboldened and commit greater crimes. But just as importantly, that total community gets destroyed through fear, deterioration, people moving and things like that. You've seen that many times in big cities. So, you know, broken windows is not the same as like zero tolerance, okay? You know, everyone who commits a crime doesn't need to go to jail, but they do have to be held accountable. So, you know, say you run into a drug addict who's, you know, committed a low-level nonviolent crime. Does it make any sense to incarcerate that person in jail where they're, going to have more access to drugs than they did on the street? Absolutely not. But there has to be some consequences. And what was developed really in the 90s, and this is by aggressive prosecutors, not soft on crime prosecutors, but people who realized what needs to be done. And the same for street prostitution. Many of these, almost all these women either have addictions, they've been abused or being trafficked. Is jail the answer for that? No, but there has to be a consequence. And you develop courts where there's diversion programs. For instance, for small-time drug possession, if you're an addict, okay, we're going to hold your sentence in abeyance. And if you enter this program, get yourself clean, show that you're making some progress, you're going to have this sentence expunged. So you give people incentive to do the right thing. You're not over incarcerating anybody, but at the same time, you're holding people accountable to some standards of civilized society. And if you don't have that, everything falls apart. So, that's the basis of broken windows. The other thing that worked in the past, because in the 90s, I'd say from 91, maybe about 2015, there were unbelievable reductions in violent crime and homicide, New York City, Chicago, LA, because they used broken windows. They responded to complaints in the community, which are mostly going to be minority communities. No one, no decent person wants some thug, some drug dealer, some gangbanger on the corner that their kids have to walk through. I mean, that's not a race issue. That's just a human issue. And so, the cops responded to that. But the final thing is, and then there's also, improvement in technology. So you really focused, the police, to go where the crime was. But then the final thing that made it work in the old days, which you don't have now, is that you had prosecutors who were working with the police and actually putting dangerous criminals in jail for stiff sentences, totally removing them from the picture. So you say, you stop crime that way. But it also sends a serious message to other criminals that if you commit crime, you're going to be held accountable. And none of that exists today. And that's why we are where we are.
We have another problem too, Shamika. Talk a bit about I know you can even tell a story, but talk about the way in which police are viewed by the community in the standpoint of how it affects how we react to crime ourselves, right? So when crime is in the community, because in affluent neighborhoods, regardless of race, or in middle-class white neighborhoods, right? Something happens, you immediately call the police, right? Oh, something happened, call the police, right? Whereas now we can't say it doesn't happen, right? Because most of the people calling the police in the Black communities are Black. All the high-profile shootings and killings by police where people were like, this cop, they act like, racist officer white was driving around looking for a Black person to attack. In 90% of those cases, someone called the police there and it was a minority. But some people are hesitant, right? Because of their thoughts on the police. And what does that do for situations when they are reluctant to do so?
Well, of course, yes, I do have a story. Just recently,
She always has a story.
Right? Someone hit my daughter's car where one of her friends, somebody that she's familiar with, and she was afraid to call the police because of all, everything that they are told constantly. She didn't want to call the police, and they end up coming and shooting him over him hitting her car. Not that she really thinks that happens all the time, but it was a group of them, we're not going to call the police.
Right.
And because they didn't, the little boy said, my parents will take care of the damages. He realized that it was his fault, but now we're getting the runaround from the parents who don't want to take care of the damages. And I had to tell my daughter, like, I understand why you kind of gave in to peer pressure not to call the police and you didn't want to put him in harm's way, but you have to call the police. That's what the police are for. And so there is this hesitancy. You even saw that with Megan Thee Stallion when she claimed that the reason she didn't call the police when she was shot in the foot was because she didn't want, the police to come and escalate. Like, how do you escalate? You just been shot, girl, call the police.
Right.
And so that's what, is happening now. Like, people sometimes, even in situations where the police should be called, are not calling the police.
Right, and here's why that's a problem. I'm gonna go to Will because I know Will's gonna have some awesome stuff to say here. And because one of the things, another thing on the flip side that Will and I talk about when we talk about the fallacies of these numbers, right? We talk about, obviously, you got to tell the truth about the murder rate and all that. But then there's another side. He talked about the right. The right makes a mistake because they used to say stuff. I remember I interviewed Will on my show one time. We were talking about, they'll say stuff like, it's lower, and Will correct me, it's lower now, but they used to say, blacks are 6 times more likely to do this than whites, 6 more times more likely to shoot somebody or do a violent crime. And I'm like, okay, let's just assume that's true. That's not the problem. The problem is you're not giving me all the information because you're not telling me what the rate is for whites. Is it 15? Because then that's 90% for blacks, and every black person should be in jail right now, right? But then you find out it's like 0.25, right? So we have this belief that all blacks are violent when the violence amongst blacks is low. It's higher than it should be, but the percentage of black people who are committing violent crime is really low. My point to tie what Shamika said to it is the problem is, and we all know, whether we follow stats or not, all you gotta do is turn on the news, that it's repeat offenders. You watch the news and you see a heinous crime, somebody pushes somebody on the tracks in New York. They were, oh my God, I catch the subway. They find the guy and it was Leroy Johnson. He had 37 prior arrests for pushing people on the tracks, right? So it's not, so if you just looked at the numbers, that's 37 black men who pushed somebody on the track. No, that's one crazy black man that should be in jail. So, and one story I think everybody forgot because we've been in so much crazy for 2 years, but do you all remember, Will, when in somewhere outside of Minneapolis after George Floyd died, the upper middle class whites got together and they said, we will not call the police. They created this circle where we won't call the police. And then someone wrote an op-ed, I wish I could find it, I should repost it, like crying like, oh my God. So the guy punched me in the face and stabbed me and I was torn because I wanted to protect my son. But at the same time, what if I called the police and they shot this poor innocent black man? Well, first of all, he's not innocent. He stabbed you. Right. Yeah. So talk about how the crime is worse in the community because you let repeat offenders go thinking you're helping.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there are a couple things there. First of all, I mean, as someone who has a sideline in weapons instruction, I mean, especially for the women in the audience, like if you're being attacked by a rapist or something like that, I mean, don't be afraid to kill him or to call the police and have them throw him in jail. The idea that you're hurting the future of a black man, well, he shouldn't be out committing rapes. Exactly. I mean, you can't really look at this along racial lines. Like a Hispanic guy, maybe. I don't know. That one's on the fence.
Right.
So
I'll call the police, but I give them a 2-minute head start.
Yeah, that's funny. There are plenty of criminals of all races. Obviously, if you're the victim of a crime, enforce the fucking law. Better yet, have the police do it for you. But I mean, I think that you're right. One of the things on the right that has kind of limited outreach to the black community is this tendency to point out, not necessarily even inaccurately, but the crime data. For example, I mean, we often hear that interracial crime in particular is about 80% black on white, which it is. And I mean, when I have one of these conversations, my response is usually to say, well, that's true, but it's also 3% of crime, right? And that kind of sets up the context. So, I mean, everyone knows I'm not going to lie about this. Sure, there's a crime problem in the black community. We all know that. At the same time, the person by far most likely to kill you is your husband or your wife. So that kind of moves this out of the sort of magical terror zone. I kind of think of it as being where you really worry walking down the streets in a normal community about them attacking you, whether that's blacks or whites. So that's sometimes been an issue with the right. But I think, Charles, what we're looking at now is kind of the flip of this issue on the left, if we want to be honest about it, though. Black people didn't normally, whether or not there's a higher crime rate in black communities, have a problem calling the police. It's worth noting, by the way, that gaps between groups. I don't want to get too wonky about this, but gaps between groups aren't rare. So like the male crime rate is 10 times the female crime rate, for example. Like almost every criminal is a young man. And then you get into categories of young men. So both Maury, who knows this from an expert position as a job, you, Charles, have said, I mean, it's this tiny group of repeat offenders. Like if someone is involved in a subway attack on an Asian woman, that's not their first subway attack on an Asian woman most of the time. That's pretty damn specific. I mean, you're looking at someone who's, a strong arm thief, and that's what they do. That's their job in a twisted kind of way. So, I mean, saying that young people, minorities in a country that used to be oppressive, men are more likely to commit crimes hasn't normally meant much. People across communities, Black, Caucasian, Italian, American, Hispanic, have generally called the cops. What we've seen right now in the Black community, getting to the point, is an extreme backlash against the police and an extremely elevated fear of kind of our white countrymen. And it's really recent. Like I would date the Great Awakening back to like 2012. So over the past couple of years, we started seeing the fear numbers creep up, where the last time I actually opened the Washington Post, I read that I believe it was 75% of Black people are scared that either policemen or just whites are going to kill them. People were saying things like, I feel like my body is in constant danger. And so now you are seeing rates of call-ins to the cops drop. I mean, and you're seeing tension between Black and white people that wasn't there before. Because if both sides believe falsely that the other side's really likely to kill them, it's hard to build a friendship on the basis of that. Like, are we good today, homie? In reality, the odds of that happening, certainly the odds of that happening in the white on Black direction, they're minuscule. And the odds of a trained cop doing that to you if you're obeying the law are basically zero. So it's a problem. I actually don't have like a glib college guy solution at the end of this. Just you have to tell the truth. That's the solution. Say that Black people, white people, cops aren't going to kill you. Turn that video off and like look at the numbers.
Right. Yeah. I would like to add, I never thought about that growing up either. Like 20 something years ago, my house was shot up. And so when I called the police, like there was no hesitation. There was no thought in my mind that the police would come and hurt me. I actually, even when they told me it was safe to come to the door, I had a butcher knife in my hand. When I opened the door, the storm door, which was glass, had been shattered, but the suction from me opening the door made the glass cave in. And of course, I was already, shaken, standing there with the butcher knife, screaming.
Did you start swinging it?
Door.
And they're like, man,
run the corners.
Knife down, and I'm going, I'm not gonna use it, and they're like, okay, but put the knife down. Like I was just so startled by, the glass falling in, but I don't even think they had their guns drawn because they knew there was a woman in the home with a small baby. They weren't coming to kill me. They weren't looking to hunt me down. And I was in a Black neighborhood. They knew they were coming because a Black woman had called the police because of a shooting.
One add on to that, I'd actually be interested in you guys. I mean, Charles, Maury, you gentlemen are a little older than me. Shamik, of course, is younger than me, but I'd be interested in whether you have anything different from my perspective. But I grew up in a pretty hood area, a couple pretty hood areas. I mean, like Bridgeport in Chicago in the 80s. Then I moved to the north side when there's still some needles on the ground in areas like Wicker Park. I moved outside of Chicago to East Aurora. These are all, they're not the hood, but like working class, tough areas. And I don't remember anyone really being all that wildly racist. I mean, people during a high school scuffle might use the racial terms for one another, but those went beyond Black and white to things like Mick. And people would also make references to your mother and like your school's athletic fortunes. I mean, it was, other than that, I don't remember that many bigots. I mean, one of my girlfriends in high school, Erin Odie, was Irish, or Erin O. One was Black, Angie. I mean, like, it just, I don't remember the urban 1990s in the North being a time of intense racism and police violence in the first place. But do you guys disagree with that? Coming from Gary, coming from Chicago, was I missing like the Klan meeting or something?
Well, mine's a little different, but not because I'm older, stop it. But really because Gary is a unique bubble, right? It's so funny because I mentioned that too before. It's still just a funny side note. It's still to this day, when I tell people I'm from Gary, I get a reaction. It's like, I'm from Gary, they go, no, not Michael. They're like, oh my God. It's like they start checking for their wallets or something. It's crazy. But the reason it's different is because Gary was not even majority black. Gary was black, right? I didn't go to school with any white people, so how could there be white thing? But if we go over to other towns, we got chased out of town. There were neighborhoods where like, you can't come in here because you're black, right? So we had those. But I mean, it was really a small window of that happening. It was like 2 years, and then it didn't happen as often, right? But everybody remembers. I always talk to my friends like, yeah, I remember going to Chesterton. I was like, yeah, well, Chesterton got plenty of black folks now. It's not the same thing.
Was that a race or a class thing? Because we used to fight kids from the projects, and it wasn't because they were black. Like a third of our guys were black. It was because we didn't want to get robbed. I mean, they were very specific. Like, no, you guys got to stop. You can't come skate here. This guy is stupid.
You know, I'm as fair as they could be. This was a race. This wasn't class. It was private. I mean, in some of the areas, like we went to Munster, it was a little bit, a high class. But if you go to like Portage, LaPorte, if you go to the neighboring, the Black Oak is in Gary. It was the poor white trash neighborhood of Gary. Same thing over there. You butt heads. This was all the same, socioeconomic class. This was race. It was like,
okay,
hey,
okay,
right. But this was also the 80s, so it was different, right? So, but when I went back in the 90s, like you talk about, when I went back at the time you were, 17, 18, there were no problems then. I mean, I had friends that lived in those areas. We'd go visit. Nobody would say. I stayed with my friend for about a year, and he lived in the neighborhood. There were no blacks in the neighborhood, but people would just be like, hey, how you doing? It was no issues. So it was, like I said, it changed really quickly. And because people had gotten chased out and didn't go back, they just assumed it was still like that. Like, I have friends that went to you go to IU, and they were just towns you knew, the sundown towns you couldn't stop in, right? And so people still talk about that today, even though black people live in those towns. They just assume, it's the same way. Things evolve. So I don't know if you want to give any insight to that, Maury, but that's my case. I would have to say, at the time when I was in school, it's a unique area because a lot of places are mostly black. This was all black, but I would say, yeah, I saw some of the specifically race stuff.
Yeah, I remember, growing up in Chicago, I spent most of the time on the north side as a kid, and then as an adult, I was south. But, I mean, there are normal tensions. I mean, I think that's just part of society. It certainly wasn't off the hook. I mean, I had friends, we'd go to black neighborhoods, it wasn't that big a deal. You'd get on the L subway. Really without fear. As a kid, I remember I was in first grade, started my first summer day camp. My mom, took me there the first day on the bus because no one drove around in cars, gave me a quarter or whatever, showed me the route. And the rest of the summer, I'm taking the bus by myself, as a first grader. It wasn't a surprising thing, so not only, I believe, were, racial tensions, I don't want to minimize it, but it wasn't a climate of, fear, of constant fear. So I think, what's changed, first of all, the reality hasn't changed. I think, if you look at individual people, black and white, this country is probably the least racist it's ever been in its history. I mean, that's the reality. And, by any benchmark, if you look at, minority, integration, wealth, intermarriage, anything you want to judge it on, the United States is by far the least racist, multiracial country in the world.
Right.
Why don't people believe that? Well, I don't think it's an accident. It's part of this leftist ideology that really wants to tear our country apart. You see it with the Soros thing. You see it with opening the borders. At every level, they're attacking the foundations of this country. And if you can get people to believe, get black people to believe, that the cops are out there to hunt them down, that, white people are their enemy, that they should be in fear, when none of the reality backs that up. Well, perception is more important than reality, because that's what people base their behavior on. But I don't believe this is accidental. It's intentional. It's at every level. It's tearing our country apart. and getting, the final connection I make, that tears down the trust of the police. If you have these, false beliefs, almost bordered on hysteria, that if a cop shows up, he's going to shoot me because I'm Black, that creates a whole snowball effect. Then people resist the police. You think it's okay to fight the police, kill the police, so it really perpetuates the problem almost by itself.
Now, I want to say this though. Definitely there is a segment of the population that's doing this intentionally, but I think we can't leave out the number one issue. The number one thing has got to be, and I'm not one of these people that say it's all bad, throw it all out. This is probably definitely more good than bad, but you have to go with 24-hour cable news and social media. And I say that because you look at the numbers. I'm sure you and Will have studied the numbers, the numbers, and people talk about, even Will earlier talked about the drop from a certain time. We had to go back to that time, right? Like I posted something when people on this gun debate and they're talking about, well, just take away the guns. I'm like, dude, Chicago had a gun ban and they had more murders than they had now. And that's counting the uptick that they've had since the Summer of Love, right? But one of the funniest stories I told, I might have said it on the show before, but my wife grew up in New York and I was watching the history of hip hop. She walks in the room and they're showing the people dancing. It's like the late 70s, early 80s or whatever. And she's like, man, she's looking at us like, yeah, the good old days. You can go to a party and not have to worry about all this madness that you have to go on. Looked at her. I was like, excuse me. I said, the year you graduated high school, there was 2,000 murders in New York. There were 200 last year. The difference is, you know why? It's because when a murder happened, if it didn't happen in your neighborhood, you didn't know, right? Because there wasn't, they didn't show it to you everywhere, and they didn't just constantly put it on a loop. Now if I see black man shot by a white man on a loop, think about it. When George Floyd died, whatever you think about how bad it is or what it reflects on policing, that was still one cop. Let's assume everything negative you think. He's a rabid racist who was looking, he got up that morning and there's video of him telling people, I'm gonna go kill a black man today. Let's assume it was that bad. It's still one cop killing one man, and in 2 hours, there were people on the streets in LA. That doesn't happen. One, obviously COVID, because people didn't have to go to work, but it doesn't happen without social media and 24-hour news. So that, those people who are intentionally trying to shift the country or tear it down, totally true that there's people out there like that. But for this accelerant that they didn't create, right? That they just used it to their advantage. I think that's the biggest thing. And not that I'm saying it's a net bad and we don't need it, but it's just the reality we live in now. Every shooting is on the news. You wouldn't know about these local news stories if people weren't telling you about them. Now there's an industry where you're supposed to go search them out and put them out there. You make money for posting them, right? So everybody's showing you every single crime, right? And so now the trust is gone, as you said. And so now you got black people. Every time a black man can't sell his house, or he sell his house for $5,000 less than he thought. We all know those stories. Like, look, he changed the paintings on his wall, and then his house went up by $200,000. I don't even argue it. I just assume it's true. I was like, yeah, give me the data that shows me it's happening writ large. You can't. You're just assuming it because somebody gave you a story. That's, I think, the biggest problem.
I read that story. I'm just, as a comment, I don't really see that there's a story at all that someone changed his realtor, changed all the art on his walls and sold his house for more money. I'm sure that there is racism out there that might be an example, but that, of course, if you improve the way your house looks and you change your agent, you're going to get more money for your house. So yeah, there are all these news agencies that are questing for this kind of shit. You have to fill up, and I don't mind either one of these, but Jacobin or the Daily Wire or anything in between needs that full scroll screen every morning. Yep, and that's where you're going to get this stuff. And that's why we're talking about, like, yeah, was that giant interracial fight at LeBron's school in Akron? Was that motivated by racism? Like, none of us is from Akron or knows anyone in Akron or even likes LeBron James, from what I understand of you guys, oops, human. So it's just like, you see that story now and you'd see it 10 times as much if the races were reversed because of that media enterprise realm. Whatever you're describing, Charles.
Right. Shamika, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, speaking of LeBron, I had a whole debate with a friend.
This is the LeBron episode.
Yeah, who got upset with me because I called him an intellectual midget. And he was saying, look how successful he is, as a basketball player. He's rich. He started school. I said, I still don't think like he's an academic. I wouldn't look at him like he's a public intellectual. But he has to be smart to be able to do, the things that he's done and make it in basketball. And I'm like, no, he had to be talented in basketball. Like,
And then the offers came. And he took
right.
advantage of it.
He had to be tall. Yeah, like there's nobody, there's no like, they don't give IQ tests in the NBA. There aren't a bunch of geniuses in there, like 6'7" black and Bosnian dudes just doing math. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a huge LeBron fan. I'll just leave
it was so frustrating because I'm like, wow, this is how we think. Because he's good in basketball, that makes him a superior man, especially.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy, but you know, I got to shift because we don't have that much time, and there's a really interesting piece to having Maury. I mean, we love having police officers who can talk about the ins and outs, but you don't often get someone who you were the chief of police in Martinsburg, West Virginia, rural, majority white town, right? And 24 years in Chicago and grew up in Chicago. So you can kind of give us a snapshot of what it's like being a police officer and policing urban areas and rural areas. So can you talk a bit about that and you know, what you took from the one to the other, and just talk about some of the differences so we can see, because you know, if we just only look at the mainstream media, all the crime is either black or just are pretended to be by black because we want to make blacks look bad, and white people are just going around doing racial crimes and nothing else.
No, absolutely. So in Chicago, you know, 24 years, almost all the time as a police on the South Side, you know, pretty, you know, busy districts, Englewood, South Chicago, you know, Roseland, places like that. A lot of gangs, a lot of drugs, a lot of guns. And, you know, so I worked my way up, or promoted up to lieutenant, you know, ran a tactical gang team, you know, worked with the suburbs, and, you know, we did a lot of good things. Going to Martinsburg, West Virginia, you know, it was a transition. I mean, you know, thank God there were no organized gangs. The level of violence was much worse. But what I didn't expect, well, I guess I studied a little bit, but seeing is really believing. The level of the heroin crisis was absolutely off the charts. West Virginia has like the highest per capita death rate of opioids in the country. And, you know, Martinsburg was part of it. And then once again, you know, the demographic is about 14% black in Martinsburg, you know, much different than where I worked. You know, so your victims here are mostly whites, a lot of poor whites. So a lot of common denominators, though, especially, you know, with any criminal, if you go to any prison, regardless of race, 85% of people in prison grew up in a home without a father. And that's across every ethnic category. It's just a constant. And that's what we saw there too. So, you know, in focusing on that, you know, I really, you know, learned, I love being a Chicago police officer, learned a lot. It was a great organization. It's fallen on hard times now. So I learned how to do a lot of things the right way. Also learned what was wrong. And, you know, basically what was wrong in Chicago was, you know, the politics, the patronage, the really bad management at the top. And, you know, I was committed to not making those mistakes. And what we were able to do in Martinsburg, and this is why, you know, I feel really good about the possibilities of in policing, is that if you have the right principles of engaging with the community, you know, focusing on crime, treating people right, you know, I put my officers through all kinds of training. It's called, you know, police legitimacy, you know, training and procedural justice to, you know, interact with people, treat them right, you know, build that trust. And then the final thing we did was focus on the drugs. I had a drug house ordinance, shut down 63 drug houses, cleaned up communities. And then the final touch was working with the schools, you know, and looking towards the future. every one of our officers, including myself, would spend time each week in a classroom, an elementary school classroom, not just there as officer friendly, but, reading books with kids, doing projects, helping them with their homework, making that personal connection. So now you do that 5,000 times a year or 5,000 students a year. You go out on the street and these kids come up to you, they remember you, you remember their name, and you make these personal connections, which, you talk about increasing, trust and credibility, legitimacy. That's how you do it, one person at a time. So, that's why I brought to Martinsburg, and, together as a team, we really made a big difference there.
Well, I want to leave on one thing. We don't want to make it seem like we just paint this with a beautiful brush and police don't do anything wrong. You talked about holding them accountable. And Will and I both have written and referenced Roland Fryer's work, and recently listened to him speak, had a chance to talk to him, and he was talking about doing a ride along. And he talked about, coming from a neighborhood where it wasn't very favorable to police officers. And so doing a ride along, he learned a lot of things and got to see some more nuance than he had before. But his writings, everybody knows him for the part about they either hate him or love him on the right, about saying, see, my research shows that police don't indiscriminately shoot blacks. But I was fair when I cited it. I also talked about the other piece, but he said, however, they are more likely to throw you up against the car, threaten you verbally, and pull a gun on you, and those kind of, do these other things that don't go to the point of shooting, right? Maybe take you out of the car when you shouldn't be, and that kind of thing. So we know these things happen. One is I don't know how we fix it, but then you definitely can't fix it when you don't even address it, which seems odd that the fix the police people never mention it. They only say shootings, which Will already gave us some stats on. So talk a bit about how pervasive that problem is and some things that we can do to minimize that.
Well, yeah, and I've read some of Fryer's work. I think with the he talked about the maybe more likelihood of going hands-on and being abusive in that way, and that can be a problem. Okay. But there's a lot of things involved. So, once again, when you talk about what I refer to as community policing, which is not being soft on crime, it's actually very much tougher on crime, because you have people officers on that beat in that community who know the community, know people, and you're much less likely to be, overly, physical with someone if you have an idea who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. Sometimes officers, I'm not saying Martinsburg was a much different situation, but big cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, I'm sure, if you're talking about this poll where, Black people think they're going to be, targets of the police, how do you think a lot of these police officers are feeling now? I mean, the, like ambush, attacks on police have increased like 130% for like 2 years in a row. So, every engagement that these officers are going in, they have a heightened sense of fear. And when you operate like that, you're much more likely, to maybe overreact out of fear and self-protection. So we're headed in a bad direction that I believe can be turned around, but we have to see what the real problems are first. And a lot of it's political. These, radical prosecutors have just undercut everything. That needs to be changed. There was some good news this week in San Francisco. The Soros prosecutor, this Chesa Boudin, who, he's a generational, left.
His mother died a couple months ago, and I didn't even put it together because I'm not in California. I knew her, but I didn't know that was him. And when they said she died, I was like, oh my God, she's a domestic terrorist, and her son's a
Yes, his parents went to prison for, I think there were Weather Underground or something like that.
Bank robbery, shooting, all that.
Which I believe, who is the governor of New York?
Currently?
No, the guy who ended up getting thrown out.
Oh,
Cuomo.
Cuomo.
Yeah, Cuomo. I think he pardoned, that parent, so.
Yeah. Of course he did.
So, anyway,
But real quick though, I mean, what do you do? I mean, you were chief of police. We got to get some police side, to got to give the left something. So this bad cop is throwing people on the hood of the car, or he's doing whatever. What do you do? I mean, I'm assuming you don't just say, you're fired. I mean, you got to be some process, right? Because they got unions. But what do you do? How do you turn that around? How do you monitor it so it doesn't continue to happen?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what I did as a chief was, number one, you train people properly. You really upgrade the training. You have expectations of what you expect from officers and how they treat people. And if they fall short of that, you hold them accountable. You try to, you discipline them. You make sure that they're following the rules. And when they don't, there's repercussions. And, that's what I did, and it works. Even when you have, and Will and I have talked about this, that public unions in general, police unions, sometimes or many times can be an impediment, to holding people accountable. Those things need to change. Didn't have a union in Martinsburg, but the civil service rules were almost worse than a union. I mean, it was so hard to do anything in terms of discipline, that the problem is a lot of chiefs and supervisors just throw up their hands and don't do anything. That's the worst thing you can do. Even if the system is rigged against you, you still have to, try to make it work. And it worked for me.
Well, we got like 1 minute here. Is there one last thing you want to take away? You want people to understand about policing today?
Well, I would say that, in terms of all the, propaganda people are facing, that police are facing and that people are being subjected to, there's a really wrong impression of what's going on with the police. Any decent police officer joins for two reasons. They want to help people and they want to make a difference in their community. And, that's at the heart of all good policing. And I think it's up to us as a country to start working together to make sure that those things can come out, because that's, what good cops want to do. But right now, it's very hard to do that job.
I think that might be the most important thing, because whether people are arguing about criminal justice reforms, what we need and whether we don't need it, the key thing is you can't do it to the police. A lot of the people who want the reforms want to sit in a room and come up with the reforms and then drop it on the laps of the police. Now go do this. I mean, at some point, at the very least, you need people in the room that done the job before that'll know that part is just totally impossible. And I can tell you why. And if you lock them out, it's going to be animosity, and then they're never going to do it. So I think that's probably a really important takeaway and a place to end. He is Maury Richards, former police chief of the Martinsburg Police Department in West Virginia. Maury, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Charles. Well, Shamika,
Thank you.
It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.